At 11:58 on September 1st, 1923, the ground beneath Yokosuka Naval Arsenal began to move. Workshops collapsed, cranes shifted, fires and destruction spread across the Kanto region. Inside the naval yard, the earthquake also struck an unfinished warship named Amagi. Amagi had begun as a battlecruiser, but Japan now intended to convert her into a large aircraft carrier. Her long hull and powerful machinery made her one of the Navy's preferred foundations for a new kind of warship. After the earthquake, that foundation was no longer trustworthy. The hull had been distorted so severely that continuing the conversion was judged impractical. Japan still possessed permission to convert two large capital ship hulls. Akagi remained. Amagi did not. A substitute had to be found. Elsewhere sat Kaga, an unfinished battleship that had already lost the right to exist as the weapon it had been designed to become. The Washington Naval Treaty had condemned her to disposal. She had not been chosen for conversion. She was slower than Amagi and shaped around guns and armor rather than aircraft. But Kaga was still intact. Within weeks, the rejected hull returned to the center of Japanese naval planning. It would be converted, tested, criticized, and rebuilt. It would eventually carry aircraft over China, join the attack on Pearl Harbor, and disappear at Midway. The earthquake did not create Kaga. It reopened a future the Washington Treaty had closed. How did a rejected battleship hull become one of Japan's most important aircraft carriers? And how much of the original ship had to be removed before the conversion truly worked? Before Kaga became an aircraft carrier, she belonged to a vision of war dominated by armored battle lines and a single, decisive engagement in the Western Pacific. Japan emerged from the First World War as a major naval power, but its planners understood a basic imbalance. The United States possessed greater industrial capacity and could build a larger fleet over time. Japan could not depend on winning a prolonged shipbuilding contest. Its naval strategy, therefore, emphasized preparation and concentration. An American fleet moving westward would be weakened by submarines, destroyers, and long-range attacks. Then, closer to Japanese-controlled waters, it would meet the Japanese battle line. Heavy guns, armor, and disciplined formation fighting would decide control of the Pacific. Kaga was designed for that imagined day. The Tosa-class battleships were intended to follow the Nagato-class and carry 10 410mm guns in 5 twin turrets. Their broad hulls were arranged around artillery, magazines, armor, and machinery powerful enough to move an enormous gun platform across the ocean. Yuzuru Hiraga, one of Japan's most important naval architects, worked within the technical establishment that shaped this generation of capital ships. He did not create Kaga alone, and he would not design every stage of the carrier she later became. But his work belonged to the design culture that produced the original hull, a culture concerned with stability, protection, weight distribution, and concentrated firepower. Kaga was laid down at Kawasaki's Kobe shipyard on July 19, 1920, and launched in November 1921. The hull entering the water contained no flight deck, aircraft elevators, or aviation fuel system. Its internal structure had been chosen for turrets, shell rooms, protective decks, and the machinery of a battleship. That fact would shape every later compromise. A purpose-built carrier begins with aircraft movement. Designers decide how planes will be stored, armed, fueled, raised to the deck, launched, recovered, and repaired. Kaga began with the opposite priority. Every aviation space would have to be inserted into a structure already organized for another form of combat. At the time, this did not automatically make conversion impossible. The carrier itself remained an uncertain weapon. Naval aircraft could scout and attack, but many officers still saw them as support for the battle fleet. Aircraft would locate the enemy, spot gunfire, or weaken a formation before battleships completed the destruction. Within those assumptions, Kaga made sense. She represented the concentrated power Japan believed it needed against a stronger opponent. But such ships consumed armor plate, weapons, skilled labor, dockyard capacity, and national budgets. Britain, the United States, and Japan were preparing capital ships whose cost was becoming inseparable from the political danger of the naval race. By the time Kaga's unfinished hull floated at Kobe, the major powers were preparing to stop that competition. She had been created for the war Japan expected to fight. Diplomacy was about to remove that future before Kaga received her guns. At the Washington Naval Conference, the leading naval powers confronted a problem that could not be solved with larger guns. The capital ship race was financially exhausting and strategically dangerous. Britain faced severe post-war costs. The United States had the resources to expand, but also strong political pressure for limitation. Japan wanted recognition as a major power, but could not comfortably match American construction ship for ship. The treaty signed in February 1922 interrupted the battleship programs of all three nations. It limited capital ship strength and required many vessels under construction to be canceled or disposed of. Kaga could no longer be completed as a battleship. The treaty did not erase the work already invested in her hull, but it removed the legal purpose for which that hull had been built. A major warship had become an expensive object without an approved combat future. Yet the treaty contained an exception. Each signatory could convert a limited number of existing capital ship hulls into aircraft carriers. For Japan, that created two precious opportunities. The Navy now had to choose which unfinished ships offered the best foundations for large carriers. That decision favored speed. A carrier must keep pace with its escorts, maneuver rapidly, and turn into the wind for aircraft operations. Its own speed helps create airflow over the flight deck. A faster hull gives pilots a greater margin during launch and recovery and prevents the carrier from becoming a burden on the formation. Japan therefore selected Akagi and Amagi. Both came from battlecruiser designs intended to combine heavy armament with higher speed than conventional battleships. Their long hulls and powerful machinery made them more attractive conversion candidates. Kaga was rejected. Her battleship hull offered volume and strength, but it did not promise the same speed. Features that had made sense in a gun battle, mass, protection, and a structure arranged around heavy weapons, were less useful in a ship whose primary striking power would leave the deck as aircraft. Kaga and her sister Tosa remained among the capital ships that could not enter service. In popular language, Kaga was headed for the scrapyard. The legal reality was broader. Treaty disposal could involve breaking a ship up, sinking it, or permanently disabling it as a warship. Her physical end had not yet arrived, but her battleship career was over. The treaty had created a sharp irony. It destroyed Kaga's original purpose while opening the only legal route by which a large unfinished hull could survive as a carrier. Kaga simply was not one of the two chosen ships. At Yokosuka, work proceeded on Amagi. The preferred hull was being prepared for aviation, while Kaga remained an unwanted alternative. Then the earth beneath the naval arsenal moved, and Japan's carefully selected second carrier ceased to be usable. The Great Kantō Earthquake was a national catastrophe, not merely a naval accident. Tokyo and Yokohama were devastated. Fires spread through crowded districts. Roads, railways, communications, and public services collapsed. The destruction also reached Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. Amagi's incomplete hull rested amid damaged structures and displaced supports. A capital ship can survive violent seas after its structure has been completed and supported as intended. During reconstruction in a shipyard, it is vulnerable in different ways. The earthquake strained and distorted Amagi before she had become the carrier Japan intended. The Navy now had to decide whether the hull could still support a long and costly conversion. Continuing work might preserve the schedule, while building permanent weakness into the finished ship. Abandoning Amagi would waste prior work and leave Japan with only one of its two planned large carriers. Inspection and engineering judgment went against Amagi. The hull was considered too badly damaged to justify completion. But the earthquake did not automatically transform Kaga. It only reopened the choice. Japan still had Akagi and still possessed permission for a second large conversion. It could surrender that opportunity, attempt a different project, or return to one of the capital ship hulls already rejected. Kaga now appeared valuable for a simple reason. The better option had disappeared. Her hull was large, substantially advanced, and structurally available. She had not become faster or better suited to aviation. She was merely intact. By late October 1923, Navy Ministry paperwork had identified Kaga as Amagi's substitute. Formal reclassification followed in November, and authorization for the conversion followed in December. The earthquake had created the emergency. A sequence of technical and administrative decisions determined which ship would survive it. Nature removed one ship. Human decisions chose the replacement. The substitution preserved Japan's two-carrier program, but it also transferred every limitation of Kaga's battleship origin into the new design problem. Amagi had offered battlecruiser speed. Kaga offered a broader, heavier hull arranged around armor and guns. Yet no navy possessed a final formula for the aircraft carrier. Britain, the United States, and Japan were still experimenting with flight decks, hangars, funnels, elevators, bridges, and armament. Converting Kaga did not mean forcing a proven carrier design into the wrong hull. The proven design did not yet exist. That uncertainty gave engineers room to attempt solutions later generations would find strange. Kaga entered Yokosuka carrying the remains of one doctrine and the expectations of another. Her internal strength had been calculated for protective decks, magazines, and heavy turrets. Her machinery had been selected for a battleship. Now the Navy wanted hangars, aircraft workshops, aviation fuel, elevators, landing space, takeoff space, and enough defensive power to protect a ship whose main weapons would leave before the battle began. The earthquake had returned Kaga to history. The next question was what kind of carrier its inherited hull would allow Japan to build. At Yokosuka, every proposed hangar and flight deck rested on the same unavoidable fact. Beneath it was a battleship. Kaga's hull offered great volume and structural strength. A large carrier needed space for aircraft, fuel, ammunition, workshops, crew, and machinery. The former battleship could support an air group far larger than Japan's small experimental carrier Hosho. But the space was not empty, and the weight was not free. The hull had been reinforced and divided around battleship requirements. Its machinery had been designed to move an armored gun platform, not to produce the highest possible speed for aviation. Internal routes had to work around existing structure. Every addition above the hull affected stability. Japan was not merely adding a deck. It was changing the organizing principle of the ship. The most visible result was Kaga's arrangement of flight levels. Today, a carrier appears inseparable from one long deck. Early designers faced a less settled problem. If aircraft were landing on the upper surface, how could the ship continue launching another group? One answer was to separate the functions vertically. Kaga received a long upper deck intended mainly for landing, with shorter flying-off decks projecting forward from lower hangar levels. Aircraft could be prepared inside the ship and launched from the bow without waiting for the upper deck to become available. The advantage was clear on paper. The carrier might recover one group while sending another into the air. Hangars and takeoff positions would connect directly, and the upper deck would not need to perform every task. The cost was built into the geometry. The lower decks were short, and their usefulness depended on light aircraft able to accelerate quickly. Naval aircraft soon became heavier. They carried more fuel, stronger structures, radios, and larger weapons. Their required takeoff distance grew, while the decks remained fixed. The stacked arrangement also consumed the forward end of the ship in a complex series of openings and short runways. It attempted to solve simultaneous launch and recovery before naval aviation had developed the disciplined deck cycles that would later make one large surface more practical. Kaga's exhaust system followed the same pattern: a genuine problem, a logical answer, and an unexpected cost. Boiler smoke could obscure a landing approach, while hot gases disturbed the air around the deck. Designers routed the exhaust through long ducts toward the sides and rear of the ship, hoping to keep the main landing area clear. But long ducts added weight and occupied space. They carried heat through areas where crews worked and lived. At the stern, the gases could still interfere with aircraft operations. The system moved the problem without eliminating it. Kaga's heavy guns revealed another unresolved assumption. The ship's main striking power would come from aircraft, yet the Navy still expected that a carrier might encounter enemy cruisers or destroyers. Kaga therefore retained a substantial battery of 20-centimeter guns. The weapons offered theoretical protection in a surface action. They also required weight, crew, ammunition, and space that could not contribute to aviation. More importantly, they exposed a doctrine still divided between the carrier as an airfield and the carrier as a conventional warship. Each of these features attempted to solve a real problem at a time when combat had supplied few answers. Should a carrier launch and recover aircraft simultaneously? Should it carry cruiser-caliber guns? Where should the exhaust go? How much speed was enough? Could a converted capital ship equal a purpose-built carrier? Kaga placed possible answers into steel. The ship was formally completed as a carrier in 1928, but administrative completion did not mean operational maturity. Trials, modifications, and fleet work still lay ahead. The decks, elevators, hangars, guns, machinery, and exhaust system now had to function in wind, smoke, vibration, and the narrow margins of landing aircraft at sea. Repeated operation would reveal how much of that carrier needed to be removed and built again. At sea, Kaga's design encountered an opponent more persuasive than any committee: repeated operation. A carrier is not proven when it leaves the yard. It is proven every time an aircraft is brought from a hangar, raised by an elevator, fueled, armed, launched into changing wind, recovered on a moving deck, and returned below for maintenance. Those cycles expose the difference between a plausible arrangement and an efficient one. Kaga could operate aircraft, but comparison with Akagi and experience aboard the ship revealed persistent limits. The converted battleship was slower. Its original deck arrangement restricted practical operating space. The long exhaust system created heat and airflow problems. New aircraft made the short, flying-off decks less useful with each generation. The Navy could accept Kaga as an imperfect early carrier, or invest again in the same hull, and remove major elements of a conversion only recently completed. Japan chose Reconstruction. The decision was expensive, but it showed that the Navy was willing to learn from evidence. Kaga would not be preserved as proof that the first design had been correct. The first rejected assumption concerned the lower flying-off decks. They had separated takeoff from landing, but aircraft growth favored a long, continuous surface. During the major reconstruction of the mid-1930s, the lower flight decks ceased to function and the upper deck was extended forward. The change did more than alter Kaga's silhouette. A full-length deck gave aircraft more room for takeoff and simplified handling at the bow. It accepted that launch and recovery would be managed through organized cycles rather than permanently separated runways. The second rejected assumption concerned exhaust. The original ducts had kept a large vertical funnel away from the landing area, but their heat, weight, and airflow effects made them unsatisfactory. Reconstruction replaced them with a more compact arrangement that reflected experience at sea rather than theory alone. The third rejected assumption was that the original conversion could absorb the future of naval aviation through minor modification. It could not. Hangars and aircraft handling spaces were expanded, machinery was improved. The ship received a small island for command and navigation. Aviation facilities were reorganized around a more mature understanding of deck operations. When Kaga returned to service, she looked much closer to the carrier later seen in the Pacific War than to the three-level vessel completed in the late 1920s. But reconstruction could not erase the hull beneath the changes. Kaga remained a converted battleship. Even after machinery improvements, she did not become one of Japan's fastest carriers. Her displacement and total investment increased, and the Navy had effectively admitted that much of the first carrier arrangement could not survive. Yet the first design had not been useless. It had allowed crews and engineers to learn on a scale unavailable aboard smaller experimental ships. The lower decks exposed the limits of one operating concept. The exhaust system showed that removing smoke from one area could create heat and turbulence elsewhere. By removing those compromises, Japan refined its understanding of the carrier itself. Kaga had now passed through three identities: an unfinished battleship, an experimental conversion, and a reconstructed fleet aviation platform. The first transformations had taken place in design offices and shipyards. The next would be judged in sustained operations, where power depended not only on steel, but on the people and organizations surrounding it. On the rebuilt Kaga, the most important machinery was not confined to the engine rooms. It was the operating system formed by pilots, deck crews, mechanics, armorers, signal teams, escorts, and staff officers. Operations over China gave Japanese naval aviation experience that drawings and peacetime trials could not provide. In August 1937, Kaga launched several attack formations over China without adequate fighter escort. Chinese fighters inflicted severe losses on the exposed bombers. Subsequent missions increasingly paired strike aircraft with escorts. The lesson was immediate. A large carrier and a large air group could not replace coordination between aircraft types. Aircraft had to be maintained, armed, and launched repeatedly. Fighters, bombers, and attack aircraft required coordination. Crews had to navigate over water, locate targets, return to a moving ship, and land with limited fuel. Damaged aircraft and exhausted pilots disrupted schedules that appeared orderly on paper. Combat exposed the danger of inadequate escort and poor coordination. The solution was not another armor plate or a longer deck themselves. It required doctrine, training, communication, and integration between aircraft types. Kaga contributed to that learning, but it did not create Japanese carrier warfare alone. Hosho had provided earlier experience. Akagi developed beside Kaga. Purpose-built ships such as Soryu and Hiryu introduced layouts conceived around aviation from the beginning. The institution was learning across a fleet. By 1941, Japan had moved beyond treating carriers mainly as support for battleships. Multiple carriers could operate as a concentrated striking force. Aircraft from several flight decks could combine into large attacks. Fighters could defend the formation, while dive bombers and torpedo aircraft approached from different directions. Kaga became one part of that system. Its combat power now depended less on the peculiarities of the old battleship hull than on the air group, maintenance capacity, escorts, fuel supply, intelligence, and command structure around it. This was the mature answer to a problem early designers had attempted to solve with stacked decks. Efficient carrier warfare did not require a separate, permanent runway for every stage of operation. It required discipline in time. The same flight deck became a launch surface, landing area, and crowded rearming space at different moments. Aircraft had to be spotted, fueled, armed, launched, and recovered in carefully controlled cycles. The solution was organizational as much as mechanical. At Pearl Harbor in December 1941, that system demonstrated its offensive power. Kaga sailed as one of 6 Japanese carriers in the striking force. Its aircraft formed part of a coordinated attack launched across hundreds of kilometers of ocean against American airfields and warships in Hawaii. This was far beyond the scouting and gunfire spotting roles once assigned to naval aircraft. Carriers were delivering the opening blow themselves. For Kaga, the contrast with its origin was complete. The hull designed to carry 10 battleship guns now projected power through aircraft. The ship saved because an earthquake had destroyed Amagi was participating in the most famous carrier attack yet attempted. But concentration created risk as well as force. On each flight deck were pilots and deck crews who required years to train. Below were aircraft, aviation fuel, bombs, torpedoes, spare parts, and workshops. A carrier force could destroy an enemy beyond visual range. If caught at the wrong moment, the same force could lose years of accumulated capability in minutes. Pearl Harbor proved the effectiveness of the system surrounding Kaga. It did not prove that the system was invulnerable, or that every inherited feature of Kaga's hull was ideal. 6 months later, near Midway, Kaga entered battle not as an experiment, but as a central weapon of Japan's carrier fleet. Its final test would not be whether it could launch aircraft. It would be whether the aviation system built into the ship could survive when destruction reached its own deck. On June 4, 1942, Kaga operated with Akagi, Soryu, and Hiryu northwest of Midway Atoll. The 4 carriers represented more than steel. They carried experienced air groups, deck crews, maintenance teams, armorers, staff officers, and knowledge accumulated through years of exercises and combat. Together, they formed the core of the offensive system that had struck Pearl Harbor. The disaster at Midway emerged from a long chain of reconnaissance failures, incomplete information, American resistance, and attacks that forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver and defend themselves. For Kaga, the decisive moment came when American dive bombers reached the formation. Multiple bombs struck the carrier. Explosions and fire spread through spaces containing the materials that made naval aviation possible: aircraft, fuel, bombs, torpedoes, and maintenance equipment. The flight deck that had required years of conversion and reconstruction ceased to function. A carrier's offensive strength creates a particular vulnerability. A battleship stores its destructive power inside turrets and magazines built around heavy protection. A carrier must move aircraft and aviation weapons through large working spaces. Hangars, elevators, workshops, and decks cannot be isolated completely without preventing the ship from operating. When fire enters that system, it can move through the machinery of aviation itself. Kaga's destruction was not a simple verdict on the battleship hull designed 2 decades earlier. The lower flight decks and original exhaust system were already gone. The ship at Midway was the reconstructed carrier, operating inside a complex tactical failure. Its loss cannot be reduced to one inherited feature, one bomb, or one design decision. But the result was unmistakable. Fires could not be controlled. After the surviving crew had been removed, the destroyer Hagikaze fired 2 torpedoes into the crippled carrier. Kaga finally sank that evening. The vessel that had escaped treaty disposal because Amagi was destroyed by an earthquake disappeared beneath the Pacific. 3 other Japanese carriers were also lost. The damage extended beyond hulls, but not because Japan lost all of its veteran carrier aviators in a single morning. Many aircrew survived. What disappeared immediately were 4 fleet carriers, hundreds of shipboard specialists, and the operating organizations required to employ 4 experienced air groups together. The aircraft could be replaced more quickly than the complete carrier system that had launched them. Midway therefore delivered a verdict not on Kaga's original 3-deck design, but on the risk of concentrated carrier power. The same system that assembled a massive strike over Pearl Harbor had placed a large share of Japan's elite naval aviation strength on a small number of vulnerable decks. What, then, survived Kaga? Not the battleship for which the hull had been laid down. That ship had died in Washington before completion. Not the first carrier configuration. Its lower decks, exhaust ducts, and hybrid surface warship assumptions had been overtaken by aircraft development and operational evidence. Not even the reconstructed fleet carrier. That ship ended at Midway. Kaga showed that a carrier needed more than internal volume. It needed speed, clean airflow, efficient aircraft movement, a long working deck, suitable machinery, and an organization capable of turning that deck into a weapon. Its first form revealed that simultaneous launch and recovery could not be solved permanently by stacking short decks. Its reconstruction showed that a navy could learn by removing features in which it had already invested heavily. Its service proved that a carrier's true power came from aircraft, crews, maintenance, escorts, intelligence, and coordination. Its loss showed how quickly that accumulated power could be destroyed. Later Japanese carriers were designed around aviation requirements from the beginning. They still faced compromises of speed, protection, capacity, and survivability, but they did not begin with the same act of forcing a new weapon into the structure of an old one. The final image of the ship is not one form but several. There is the battleship drawing, with turrets placed along a hull intended for the decisive gun battle Japan expected. There is the early carrier, with 3 flight levels, long exhaust routes, heavy guns, and the visible uncertainty of a navy still learning how aircraft should operate at sea. There is the rebuilt ship, with a full-length deck and a silhouette reshaped by evidence. And there is the wreck near Midway, far below the surface after the kind of battle that could scarcely have been imagined when Kaga was laid down in 1920. The Great Kantō Earthquake did not design that sequence. It did not decide that Japan would embrace massed carrier warfare, attack Pearl Harbor, or lose 4 carriers at Midway. It simply removed Amagi and returned Kaga to the list of possible futures. Everything that followed came from human choices. The treaty that ended one kind of ship, the ministry that selected a substitute, the engineers who inserted aviation into a battleship hull, the crews who exposed its weaknesses, and the institution that paid to rebuild the carrier rather than abandon it. Kaga was born for the wrong war, saved by a disaster, and rebuilt for a new one. The ship did not survive that new age, but the lessons extracted from its steel did.